especially excited to look at first aorist active and middle with you here. It's at this point that many students have a bit of a fog, but it's also at this point that you can begin to distinguish the root and the stem patterns most clearly. And hopefully what I have been discussing with you at the beginning of each of these screencasts on verbs here will begin to make more sense, and having a big picture view, though it may take a bit longer to assimilate all of the information, now that you have the full landscape, you'll have a slot to in which to put the information we're looking at here. Let's pray and ask God's blessing. Lord, I pray that you will help students to see the bigger picture of verbs and see how things fit together, and that you will help them with this larger framework to make sense of verbs, and I know that you're going to do that. Strengthen them as they read your word and read it in Greek. Help them in knowing what's most important to remember and knowing what they can come back to and look up later. I ask in Christ's name, amen. So again, thinking about the idea of past time here. We have thought about the imperfect, we have thought about the aorist with the second aorist. That's what we began with in the previous chapter, and now we're looking at the first aorist. And you say, well, what is the difference between the two? And the difference is only in form. There is no difference in meaning. So the second aorist and first aorist are exactly the same in meaning. What we have here with the imperfect is that continuous idea, but occurring in the past. With the aorist, we have just a simple statement. Yeah, normally in the past, and it's just a simple statement. It's a perfective aspect, a simple undefined, just that something happened. That is the aorist. And the imperfect here is a continuous idea. You can remember that the imperfect is built on what stem? Yes, the present stem. And that is why it has this continuous internal aspect. Our augment patterns, just by way of quick review, when we have past time, we have an augment, an epsilon is added, or a lengthened vowel. Diphthong also lengthens, and those patterns here, especially I, A, and oi, to O, A, and A. Just keep those patterns in mind, and this augment always goes with secondary endings. So it's the secondary endings, not second aorist, but just the secondary endings and not the primary. So the primary endings never go with an augment. Our personal endings then, again, the primary and the secondary are distinguished because these are considered for past time. And the primary are a different nuance of time. It can be a combinative with the perfect we'll see soon enough, or with the present, a continuous kind of activity, and in the present time normally, but it's the secondary that have a bit more of a temporal ordering to them. We'll see today that there's a bit of flexibility here with the first aorist and the first singular ending, and we'll also see a bit of nuance here, so keep those in mind, this first singular and third singular. We have thought repeatedly about the root-stem distinction, and I want to note again for you the importance of page 450, but also look at page 260. You may want to pause the screencast and just go there for a minute. Make sure your textbook is open to page 260. I want to note with you there about halfway through the page it says multiple stems, pattern 2. The reason there are multiple stems when we come up to building our tree is because there are multiple roots. And the reason for multiple stems, again, multiple roots. And we have thought already about erchomai erg, and elle youth. So I'm not going to rehearse that again, but just to look there, erg and elle youth, and then op ergomai, ace ergomai, ech ergomai, pros ergomai. All those are based on these two roots, which are then taken up into stems. The present here with erg, and then elle youth going to the future, and the aorist here, the future active, and the aorist active, and with the loss of a couple of letters. So we're familiar with these two stems, but what I want to think about for a moment is the continuation of that pattern of our stems and multiple stems and multiple roots here, because there are a couple of others to look at. One is Lego. So we have leg, and that stem for I say or speak is taken up by the present here. But you'll notice if you move over, we have air, that first letter, that upsilon looking letter here. This is the digamma, and it just drops off. So we have air, and then we have that same, and it drops off, and ip. There is a typo on that, that line, the third from the bottom in that section there, beginning with Lego. This should be ip and not id. So there's a typo in the book there on page 360, and you can confirm that by looking at page 457. And notice here, Lego is used for the present, but then air here is used for the future active, and then the aorist uses ip for the aorist active and middle. So when you get into a text, the stems are going to look different because there are three different roots involved. And the same for oida, the next word down, and chorao. And you can look at page 457 and 458 to see those specifically. So again, the reason we have different stems, because we have different roots. So let's think about the first aorist active for a moment. We have here our root again and a stem, and with luo, there's consistency between root and stem, and that is what we have here. Our tense formative is the new term that we bring in with the first aorist. Instead of a connecting vowel, it has a tense formative. Because this tense formative includes a vowel, we don't need a connecting vowel. We can do away with that because of the alpha right there. And whenever we have an augment, we have what kind of ending? Secondary. Those will always go together. So our augment, our stem, aorist active, tense formative, sigma alpha, secondary ending, elusom. Now, there are a few nuances, as I mentioned earlier. With the first aorist active, just with the first aorist active, this personal ending goes away. What are we expecting here? We're expecting a letter nu, but it drops off. It's gone. And the reason one reason it drops off just pragmatically is so that we can distinguish that first singular from the third plural, because you remember with the second aorist, those were exactly the same. And because of that, we had to keep in mind context completely determined if we're talking about I, first singular, or they, third plural. But here, with the first aorist active, we can distinguish because no personal ending is used. Notice also that the sigma alpha becomes sigma epsilon, and that allows us to distinguish the third singular from the third plural. The square of stops needs to be kept in mind, as Mounts notes here in the chapter on first aorist, because sometimes that stem will end in a labial or a velar or a dental. So here's our labials, P, beta, phi, our velars, kappa, gamma, chi, and dentals, tau, delta, theta. And if a stem, so any one of these is the final consonant in a verb stem, it's going to bump up with sigma here because of the sigma alpha tense formative for the first aorist active. And because of that, we're going to have a combination, and at some point we will see something like C alpha here. C alpha as here. Sometimes though with the dental, we'll just have that drop off and we just have the sigma alpha pattern here. So that square of stops reminds us that sigma is strong when it bumps up against a consonant, but here, even in this screencast, we'll remember that when sigma occurs between two vowels, it's weak and drops off. When we think about the letter sigma here, we have another opportunity to think about its peculiarities. Sigma does not, it's difficult to pronounce it by lambda, mu, nu, and rho. These are our liquid letters. You remember those from the chapter on the future. We thought about liquid letters. So stems that end in lambda, mu, nu, and rho. Because it's difficult to pronounce one of those letters and then follow it with sigma alpha, what happens is that the liquid aorist just drops the sigma, and instead we have just the alpha as our tense formative. So we have our aorist stem here, and men is our stem, and notice there's a bit of a lengthening to main, and normally that lengthened stem reminds us of the present, right? Because it's the furthest from the root. So how are we going to distinguish between the present and the aorist? Well, if this may look similar, may remind us of a present, how are we going to distinguish? Two factors right here. One, the augment. A present never has an augment. Second, the alpha, the tense formative. The present never has an alpha tense formative. This would be omicron if it were present. So we have our liquid aorist active indicative, and we have the similar pattern here. That first singular drops off, and we can therefore distinguish between third plural. We have that same alpha to epsilon change here in the third singular. Now let's think about the middle for a moment. We've thought about first aorist active and liquid. Now let's think about the middle for a moment. We have again our root and then a stem, and here with luo it's the same. We have our tense formative as sigma alpha. That sigma alpha tense formative works for the active and the middle for aorist. We'll see that there's a different tense formative for the passive with the aorist. That's to come, but for now, this sigma alpha for active and middle with the aorist. Augment always means secondary endings. So we have our augment, secondary endings, tense formative, and stem. You're seeing continually that when we look at verbs, we can think of them as having slots. And it's helpful to do that, especially here with the change in the connecting vowel. Instead of the connecting vowel, we have a tense formative. Why? Because we already have this vowel alpha included. Same with the liquid aorist. And there, the liquid aorist, sigma alpha, that alpha the sigma goes away. We have alpha to replace the connecting vowel. Paradigm then of the first aorist middle indicative. Our endings, main, saw, ta, metha, sitha, nta. Beautifully consistent sigma alpha all the way through. How, though, do we get from saw saw to sew. Well, we remember that the sigma between two vowels is weak and drops off. Omicron with alpha equals omega. Our master verb chart, I know this is small. If you need to pause the screencast and look through a little more closely, grab a magnifying glass perhaps, but just keep in mind the pattern here. Wherever we have an augment, we also have secondary endings. We think about the tense formative. When we have a tense formative that ends in a vowel, then we don't need a connecting vowel. Our vocab starter, keep in mind, again, as we have looked at in so many screencasts, the difference between the actual word, the lexical form, again, which is always the present, and the root here. The root always has that asterisk by it. And sometimes there are more than one root. That's why there are different looking stems. And keep that in mind as you go through. I'm going to write two more page numbers here again. Page 450 and after that. That is just a crucial chart for you. But also look here at pages 259 is where it begins, but especially page 260 and that pattern 2, multiple stems. And that is going to be so helpful for you to think about the difference between the root and the stem. And keep in mind that for Lego there, that is one root. Another is air, because that digamma there drops out. So air actually becomes your root that a stem is built upon. And the last column should be iota, p, ip, and not id. And you can see page 457 for that. Keep pressing on and remembering the distinction between these verbs. And again, the big picture, let me just give one more note, thinking big picture here. What we want to distinguish is not so much between second aorist and first aorist, because there is no difference in meaning. They're equal in meaning. Different forms, especially with this sigma alpha here, or alpha with the liquid, but the meaning is exactly the same. I'm not worried that you distinguish those two, but we must distinguish between the present, the imperfect, and the aorist. Because here we have a true distinction. The present is this continuous in the present time. The imperfect is continuous in the past time. And the aorist is just a simple statement that something happened, a perfective aspect. So these two have a continuous aspect. These two are both past time, but there are distinctions, especially between the present and the aorist in terms of their aspect, and a distinction between the present and the imperfect in terms of their time. So if you come to a verb, we need to distinguish between an imperfect and an aorist, because the aorist is just this simple statement that something happened, where the imperfect is that action's going on in the past. We have to distinguish between a present and an aorist, because the present is that something in the now is viewed as ongoing, where the aorist just has it as a simple statement that it happened. This is the beauty of Greek verbs. It's this interplay that is getting a bit messy here in the screencast, but it's this interplay that is the very goal of exegesis when we come to verbs.